The Corvast one glided through the darkness of space, its angular hull reflecting the distant glow of a dying sun. The vast emptiness stretched endlessly in all directions, an abyss where only silence reigned. The vessel was one of the finest in the Velari fleet, designed for deep space reconnaissance and rapid assault, but today it was here for something different. An investigation into the unknown. Commander. Scar-Thal sat rigid in his command chair, his three violet-hued eyes scanning the data streaming across the console. His dark, scaled hands gripped the armrests, tension evident in the subtle tremors of his fingers. For centuries, the Velari had catalogued and monitored countless civilizations, deciding which species were worthy of joining the galactic order and which needed to be contained. The humans had been one such species, isolated, monitored from a distance. Their world, classified as a low-threat anomaly, had been left untouched for centuries. And yet, something had changed. For nearly a full cycle, every Velari patrol sent to observe Earth had vanished. No distress signals, no emergency beacons, no wreckage. Just silence. The kind that gnawed at the back of the mind, whispering that something was deeply, horribly wrong. Scar-Thal had studied the mission reports before departure, reviewing the last known transmissions from their lost vessels. Most had been routine status updates, nothing unusual, until the final fragmented messages, distorted audio, static-filled bursts of panicked breathing. The last words of the missing crews had not been those of warriors in battle, but of a prey realizing too late that they were being hunted. Now that Corvast was nearing the planet itself, Earth, a world of blue and green, swirled below, them covered in dense cloud formations and deep oceans that stretched across its continents, a world that should have been teeming with life. But the scanners told a different story. "Commander," Lieutenant Vekrath murmured, his elongated fingers dancing over the glowing control panels. His voice was quieter than usual, subdued, as if speaking too loudly would draw some unseen horror upon them. "Scanning complete. There are no signals, no active satellites, no planetary broadcasts, just trace power readings from abandoned facilities." He paused, his dark eyes flickering with unease. "There's no sign of intelligent life." Scar-Thal's jaw tightened. That was impossible. A planet that once housed billions could not simply go silent. Even in total extinction scenarios, nuclear war, biological collapse, there were always remnants. The remains of civilization. Signals from survivors, but here there was nothing. "Double-check the deep surface scans," Scar-Thal ordered, though he already knew the result wouldn't change. "Look for biosignatures underground in the oceans, anywhere." Vekrath obeyed, rerouting power to the ship's long-range scanners. Data scrolled rapidly across the holographic displays, cycling through layers of the planet's crust, its atmosphere, its vast seas. But the results remained unchanged. No large populations, no communication networks, no movement that suggested the presence of an active civilization. "This doesn't make sense," Vekrath muttered, shaking his head. "Even in the most extreme cases, a planetary population doesn't just vanish." Scar-Thal leaned forward, staring at the swirling clouds below, a growing unease creeping into his chest. He had seen countless battlefields, planets ravaged by war, civilizations reduced to ashes. But this was different. There was no destruction, no decay, just emptiness. As if the humans had simply ceased to exist. And yet, something was there. The ship's passive scanners flickered, detecting faint residual energy signatures spread across the surface. Power grids that should have failed long ago were still holding minimal charges. Military installations remained intact. And in the depths of the abandoned cities, thermal readings, weak, almost imperceptible, hinted at something lurking in the ruins. Vekrath exhaled, his fingers tightening over the console. "Commander, I recommend we launch a reconnaissance probe before sending a landing team, just in case." Scar-Thal hesitated. His instincts screamed that something was deeply wrong, But hesitation had no place in Velari doctrine. They were the superior species. They ruled the stars. If the humans had fallen, it was their duty to confirm it. "Negative," he said firmly, standing from his chair. "We need answers, not distant observations. Prepare the landing craft, we're going down." Vekrath's expression darkened, but he gave a short nod. "Yes, Commander." As the crew moved to prepare for descent, the scanners flickered again. A whisper of static, a ghost signal that shouldn't have been there. A transmission, faint, distorted, coming from the surface. Scarthal turned sharply, his frills rising in alarm. The sound repeated, clearing slightly. A voice, a single phrase whispered, through layers of interference, "You shouldn't have come." The Huracan Master descended slowly through the dense atmosphere of Earth, its reinforced Velari hull slicing through thick grey storm clouds that crackled with distant lightning. The city below stretched endlessly in every direction, its towering structures standing eerily intact, untouched by war, disaster, or decay. The streets were devoid of movement, the once bustling human civilization seemingly frozen in time, abandoned yet undisturbed. There were no wrecks, no bodies, no signs of struggle, just a world that had simply gone silent. Commander Furos, Scarthal Shi, remained seated inside the landing craft, his 3 violet eyes scanning the status displays in front of him while his claws tightened against the armrests. He had expected some sign of destruction, a scorched battlefield, or the chaotic ruins of a war-torn civilization, but instead, what lay before him was something far more unnatural. The sensors of the Korovast, still orbiting above, had detected no mass extinction events, no lingering radiation, no biological weapons in the air. Nothing. To explain why an entire species had seemingly vanished without a trace. "Final approach in 10 seconds, the pilot announced, his voice steady but lacking the usual confidence of Velari warriors. Scarthal turned his gaze toward Lieutenant Vekrath, who stood beside him, his elongated fingers tapping rapidly against the scanning console as he tried to process the ever-growing anomalies in the data. His frilled crest flickered with subtle unease, a rare display of discomfort from an officer who had been trained for planetary incursions on hostile worlds. "Status?" Scarthal demanded, his tone sharp but restrained. Vekrath took a moment before responding, his dark eyes narrowing as if trying to make sense of something beyond logic. "No changes, Commander. Atmospheric readings remain stable, no life signs detected within standard scanning range, no movement. But the power grids in certain areas of the city are still functional. Some energy signatures are faint, scattered, but consistent, as if something is maintaining them at minimal levels." Scarthal's frills twitched at the implications. A world abandoned for decades, centuries even, would have seen its power grids collapse naturally. Yet here, something was keeping them running just barely, as if to give the illusion that nothing had changed. As the Fai, Zorkan landed with a controlled hiss of compressed air, the boarding ramp extended onto the empty streets. The Betif squad of Vehlari soldiers moved in formation, their advanced battle armor gleaming under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Their boots echoed in the silence as they scanned their surroundings, their weapons raised, their movements calculated. Scarthal stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the vast concrete jungle before them. Buildings towered above like silent sentinels, their windows dark and empty, their interiors veiled in shadow. Vehicles remained parked along the streets, untouched by time, as if their occupants had simply stepped away for a moment, but have returned. Vekrath adjusted his scanner, his expression darkening. "Commander, there are traces of heat signatures scattered across different points inside the structures, but they are inconsistent, fluctuating as if something is there one moment and gone the next. It's impossible to lock onto a specific source." Scarthal exhaled slowly, his instincts screaming that something was deeply wrong. "We need answers. Move toward that central building. We start there." The squad advanced cautiously, their footfalls the only sound in a world that had forgotten what noise was. As they entered the massive structure, the air grew noticeably thicker. Not in terms of pressure, but in presence, as if something unseen had been watching, waiting, and now with their arrival had begun to move. The interior was pristine, untouched by looters or scavengers. Desks remained neatly arranged, chairs still pulled up to them. The walls were lined with long-dead screens, monitors frozen on what appeared to be last-used security feeds, grainy images of abandoned corridors and silent halls, as if someone had deliberately left everything running before they disappeared. Their sound, faint, subtle, but unmistakably real. Scarthal froze. His soldiers did the same. The noise had come from deeper within the structure, something shifting in the shadows, something aware of their presence. Vekrath swallowed hard, adjusting his scanner again. The heat signatures, Commander, they just moved. They weren't erratic before, but now they're converging. Scarthal raised a fist, signaling the squad to halt. The air around them felt wrong, not just still but expectant, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Then the lights flickered, not in a power failure, not in a system overload, but in a sequence. A controlled, methodical pattern, one after another, leading deeper into the building like a silent invitation. A metallic clang echoed from above. One of the soldiers turned his visor up, just in time to see something retreating into the darkness, too fast to be fully seen, but not fast enough to be mistaken for a trick of the light. Vekrath's breathing hitched. Commander, but we're not alone. Scarthal's grip tightened on his weapon. He had fought countless battles, had stood against enemies who screamed and charged into war, but this was different. There was no war cry, no declaration. Only silence, and the unmistakable feeling that they had already walked into a trap. The silence inside the abandoned structure was not empty. It was alive, pressing against them like a presence just beyond perception. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for them. Commander. Scarthal moved cautiously through the vast hall, his boots echoing faintly against the polished, dust-covered floor. His team followed, their weapons raised, the blue glow of their energy rifles casting faint reflections against the metallic surfaces of the room. The building, once an administrative center of human operations, was eerily intact. Desks neatly arranged, monitors frozen in place, chairs slightly turned as if their occupants had merely stepped away for a moment. Nothing was broken. Nothing was damaged. It was as if the entire city had been abandoned in an instant. Lieutenant Vekrath adjusted his visor, his secondary eyes darting across his HUD display as he tracked the faint, shifting heat signatures in the depths of the facility. The readings were inconsistent, flickering in and out, impossible to lock onto. Something was moving. Or worse, something was there but didn't want to be seen. Commander. Vekrath's voice was a whisper, though he knew full well there was no reason to whisper. The signatures, they keep changing. I've never seen anything like this before. One second they're there, the next, nothing. Scarthal's frills twitched slightly in irritation. He had spent decades in planetary incursions, leading operations against hostile forces, but this was different. There were no enemy lines, no battlefield strategy to analyze, only a void where life should have been. Stay sharp, he ordered, his voice low but firm. Whatever is here, it doesn't want to be found. A sound, faint, subtle, just behind them. Scarthal spun, weapon raised, but nothing. Was there? The soldiers shifted uneasily, scanning the space behind them. The monitors in the room flickered for a brief second, just static, but it was deliberate. A pulse of white noise cutting through the silence. The transmission was human, faint, distorted, a single line of whispered static bleeding through their comms. We see you. One of the soldiers fired instinctively, the plasma bolt illuminating the room before slamming into the far wall. The sound of the shot faded, but nothing else followed. No movement, no retaliation, just silence. Vekrath's breathing had quickened. That transmission, it's coming from inside the building. Scarthal's eyes narrowed. That's impossible. There's no active power source strong enough to... The emergency lights flickered out. For an instant, they were plunged into absolute darkness. Their visors switched automatically to thermal, but the screens were eye-glitched, distorting their field of vision with erratic static. The heat signatures they had been tracking shifted violently, moving at speeds too fast for any known species. Then a scream. A soldier at the rear of the formation vanished. No struggle, no sound, just an empty space where he had stood moments before. His life signal blinked red on the HUD, then disappeared entirely. "Contact!" someone shouted, firing blindly into the darkness. The lights returned, flickering weakly, but the soldier was gone. No blood, no remains. Just gone. Vecrath scanned desperately. "Commander, his signal, it's not just lost, it's deleted. It's as if he was never here." Scarthal's grip tightened on his rifle. The shadows beyond the room seemed deeper now, as if the building itself was closing in on them, watching, waiting. A sound drifted from the corridor ahead. Not footsteps, not machinery. Breathing. Slow, controlled, methodical. A voice followed. Calm, human. "You shouldn't be here." Then, the sound of movement, everywhere at once, and the squad realized, too late, that they were surrounded. The silence no longer felt empty. It was crowded, thick with unseen shapes lurking just beyond perception. The squad stood frozen, their weapons raised, their breathing controlled but sharp, the instinctual tension of prey realizing it had walked straight into a predator's den. The emergency lights flickered weakly, barely holding on to their power, their glow casting fragmented shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally, stretching and curling as if something was watching from within them. Commander Peter Scarthal Kiwase forced himself to move, his grip on his rifle firm, but his frills betraying the rising unease in his core. His warriors were some of the most elite soldiers in the Velari Dominion, trained to dominate lesser species, to operate with absolute control. Yet here control was slipping from his grasp, dissolving like mist in the presence of something that should not exist. "Status report," he ordered, his voice even, though his throat felt tight. Lieutenant Vecrath didn't respond immediately, his secondary eyes darting over his interface, struggling to make sense of the chaotic data. "Sir," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "the thermal readings are still moving, but they're not bound to biological patterns. They're appearing, disappearing, shifting, as if they are part of the environment itself." His fingers twitched over the scanner, rerouting power in an attempt to stabilize the readings. "They don't behave like life forms, but they are alive." Scarthal didn't like that answer. He liked even less what came next. The breathing and slow, measured, deliberate returned, but this time it wasn't from a single direction. It came from all around them. Then the whispering began. It wasn't Velari, it wasn't human, it was a distorted, layered imitation, as if the voices had been stolen and replayed years out of sync, creating a nightmarish echo of reality. Words slipped through the air, but they were wrong, sentences fractured and rearranged, spoken not as communication, but as mockery. "Stay together," Scarthal ordered, his voice a low growl. "Do not break formation." Then, the first scream. One of his soldiers, the one closest to the far corridor, was pulled into the darkness. No struggle, no resistance. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. His signal erased from their HUDs, as if he had never existed. The key. Others reacted instantly, weapons discharging in precise arcs, blue plasma bolts illuminating the hallway like flashes of lightning. The walls burned where the energy struck, but nothing screamed, nothing fell. Vecrath's breathing was sharp, his voice barely steady. "Commander, they're playing with us." Scarthal knew it. He had known it the moment the lights flickered. This was no simple planetary extinction, no failed first contact. This was a trap. And they had walked into it without realizing they were already dead. A shadow flickered past them, and one of the soldiers pivoted, firing blindly. Only to vanish in an instant. His gun clattered to the floor. His body was simply gone. The whispering grew louder. The laughter started next. It wasn't human laughter. It wasn't anything natural. Scarthal tightened his grip, his pulse hammering against his skull. We need to fall. Back now the lights had shut off completely. And then, in the absolute blackness, a voice came, clear human, but Makmada wrong. You should have run when you had the chance. The darkness was absolute. Not just the absence of light, but something deeper. Something unnatural. It pressed against them like a living thing, swallowing their forms, making the vast corridors feel smaller, more claustrophobic, as if the walls themselves had shifted closer. The squad stood still, weapons raised, their visors struggling to recalibrate against the interference saturating the air like a static charge. Every breath felt louder, every movement magnified in the oppressive silence. Commander Scarthal knew they were sad losing. This was no ordinary battle. There were no enemies he could see, no positions to flank, no strategy to deploy, only the creeping realization that they had already fallen into something they didn't understand. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to abandon the mission to Taranji, but the Velari Dominion did not run. They conquered. And yet, for the first time in his long career, Scarthal wondered if this was a fight they could not. Where's a noise I drifted through the void? Not footsteps, not machinery. Something shifting. Slow. Deliberate. Then the whispering returned. It was louder now, less fragmented, more unfocused. The voices no longer spoke in chaotic bursts, but in something closer to words. But they weren't words of fear. They weren't cries for help. They were warnings. Leave. Run. Too late. The whispers slithered through the comms, crackling and broken, but unmistakably human. And yet, the voices carried no emotion, no desperation, only certainty. Lieutenant Vekrath was furiously scanning his display, his breath shallow, his frilled membranes vibrating with stress. Commander, you're the missing soldiers. Their life signs, they're back. Scarthal's eyes snapped toward him. What? Vekrath swallowed. Their signals, they just reappeared. Not far, but the readings are wrong. Scarthal's frills tensed. Define wrong. Vekrath hesitated, his throat tight. The biometric data isn't stable. It's fluctuating, and as if they are alive and dead at the same time. Echoed through the hallway. A footstep. Then another. And then they returned. The missing soldiers stepped out of the darkness. Their movements were too slow, unnatural, as if their bodies were remembering how to move. Their armor was intact, their weapons still gripped in their hands, but something was wrong. Their visors glowed with a pale, flickering light, as if the power within them had been drained and replaced by something else. The squad froze. No one fired, no one spoke. Then one of the returned soldiers, Markirit, raised his head. His visor was cracked. Beneath it there was nothing, no face, no flesh, just darkness. Scarthal's grip on his rifle tightened, his claws pressing into the metal. Identify yourself, he demanded. The figure had tilted its head, slow, unnatural, like an insect assessing its prey. Then it spoke. Commander, it said. The voice was its own, but layered underneath something else. A more second voice, deeper, older, speaking in tandem. You should not have come here. Then the lights came back on, and Scarthal finally saw what was standing in front of them. The squad opened fire. Plasma tore through the hallway, striking the returned soldiers directly. But they did not fall. They did not bleed. They merely absorbed the impact, their bodies flickering like shadows caught in the wrong dimension. And then, in unison, they moved, not attacking, not charging. They simply walked forward, through the gunfire, through reality itself. And one by one the squad disappeared, their signals blinked out, consumed by the same empty void. Scarthal refused to go like this. "Vekrath," he shouted, "get us out of here." But when he turned, Vekrath was already gone. Only static remained on his signal. The whispering returned, no longer a warning, no longer human. It was laughter. Now, and in his last moments, Scarthal understood. The humans had never disappeared. They had become something else, and now, so would he.